In this lesson, we'll talk about some good workflow practices to keep in mind when it comes to applying materials. So when you're rendering out something that you want to look absolutely photorealistic, a lot of times it can be easy to really kind of underestimate the importance of your materials. Now, the fact is that a lot of people tend to place a lot more emphasis on light, and really that's not always a good way to go, because even if your lighting is absolutely perfect and looks absolutely great, if your materials look wrong, then your scene is always going to look fake, or some way or another it's going to look just wrong to the viewer. So when it comes to working, a lot of times I find that the majority of my time actually gets spent on the materials. You can see that our lighting has come together relatively quickly, but what's going to really make or break this scene is the materials. So let's start with just a little bit of material work here. Now, we're not going to texture every single thing in this scene because that is going to get fairly repetitive pretty quickly, but we will talk about maybe just a few of these major areas, or a few things to keep in mind whenever it comes to working with this. So let's start with something like this little backing piece right behind the television. So I'll press the M key on my keyboard and just right click, make a new material, Mental Ray, Architectural and Design, just like we've done previously. Now for this, I'd like to have a little bit of a marble kind of appearance, so kind of a marble slab here. So let's go into our diffuse color map. Let's drag out a standard material. And I find that a good material or a good texture to use for this would be a dent. So here's my dent map that's been plugged in. If we get in fairly close to this, you can see it's got kind of a nice little marbled pattern to it. So I can double click on this. Right now I feel like that vein is a little bit too thick that's running through this marble. So we can dial up the iterations and sort of thin that out a little bit. We can also start to increase the strength a little bit and give us a little bit more contrast between some of the lights and the dark. So I'm going to bump this up to maybe around a value of 80. That seems to work pretty well. And now I just need to choose my colors. So for this more of a white color in here, I don't want this to be just a pure white. So maybe sort of a kind of a reddish yellow, just very, very subtle in here. So maybe something like that. Again, just a very, very subtle kind of off-white. For this vein color, I want it to be relatively close to the base color, but just a very slight amount darker. So we'll start with that little eyedropper and just sample my lightest color in here, and then just make this a little bit darker. There we go. So just a nice little subtle difference in here. And we can take this, drop that onto this little backing plate. Now my reflections on here are probably going to be a little bit too strong, but we can just take a quick render and see how we're looking. Now at this point, once we start to get into a lot of the material work, this is where I start to kind of bring my quality settings up just a little bit more. So if I go into my render setup, I'll start with my final resolution. I really don't want to output this as a 640 by 480 image. I'd want to do something, in my case, maybe something a lot more along the lines of 1280 by 720, more of a widescreen format. Now, something that, again, is fairly important when it comes to working with materials. Again, we don't want to waste a whole lot of time rendering this entire image just to see this one little section of our room. So this is where it starts to become really important, again, that we start to rely maybe a little bit more on our regions for rendering. So what we may have to do is, once we choose a region, because we changed our image resolution, the region sometimes doesn't like to be drawn here. So what we might need to do is just go into our actual viewport and just move that region to where we want it. There we are. And now Shift Q to re-render. Okay, so the image has been rendered out, and you can see definitely our reflections are very, very strong here. So we'll have to come in and make some adjustments to that. Just bring up that material editor once again. For the reflectivity, that's probably a little bit strong for my overall reflection. So let's maybe bring this down to something like 0.3. For my glossiness, marble is usually not going to be quite that shiny. So I might give this a little bit higher glossiness value, maybe something like 0.8 or 0.9. And I will go ahead and turn on my index of refraction, or this Fresnel reflection, for my BRDF. Again, that's going to be something that is much more physically accurate. a lot closer to how things actually respond in real life to light and reflections. Now I might come in here and just maybe shorten up my render region a little bit more, just because I really don't necessarily need to render every single thing. Again, really focused a little bit more on just having my render come back as quickly as possible. So give this just a second to render out. Okay, and you can see once this finishes that if I were to get in here a little bit closer, maybe just turn off my region manipulator, there we are. Now I can get in just a little bit closer. And we can start to see that overall this is starting to look pretty good. It may have a little bit more kind of noise in here than what we might want. This might be a little bit easier to see. If I were to go back to my region manipulator, maybe pull this down a little bit more so I can re-render this area. This might give us a little bit better opportunity to see kind of the area that I want to point out. Okay, so once that finishes, again, just get in here a little bit closer. You can start to see sort of the noise that I'm talking about in here. Now, this can be fixed up in a couple of different ways. This is most likely coming from our sort of glossy reflections that we've introduced in here. So if I come back to my glossy reflection samples, we can start to dial this up. Now, as far as how high you need to bring these values, this is really dependent on your particular scene. Typically, the more glossiness you have in here, so as if you wanted something that was really, really blurry, like the reflections on our wooden floor, you'll probably need to use higher samples. So in my case, I'll use something a little bit more manageable. Start with something maybe like 20. And again, Shift Q to re-render just this little region. Okay, and in my case, that does seem to help a little bit as far as reducing some of that noise. Now let's come in and start to give these cabinets here a new material. So I'll just move over. Again, right-click, New Metal Ray Material, Architectural and Design. This sort of a cabinet here, we want to have a little bit more of a wood type material. So I actually have a texture map for that. So I'll come in, drag out a diffuse color map, and we'll just plug in a bitmap. For this one, I'm going to use this wood texture. Again, we're going to leave all these settings at the default, and just plug that in. Now, I'll just move this over, and Control-click to add these different pieces of this cabinet. That looks like everything. So I can now take that material, drop that on here, assign to selection. Now if this material active, I can let that be seen here in the viewport. Oops, looks like I accidentally had some extra pieces of my room selected. So let's try that again. You can see it actually dropped that wood material onto just about everything in the room. Assign to selection, there we go, much better. So now let's take a look at some of the settings for this. Again, with this wood material, we probably want this to be a little bit softer. We don't want this to be quite a mirror type reflection. So we'll bring that reflectivity maybe down to 0.2. And the glossiness, same thing, probably something like 0.2 or 0.3. We'll start with maybe 0.2. And let's pull open our rendered frame window. I'll come in and grab my region, move that down a little bit further, so that way I'm just rendering this little piece with my cabinets. Re-render that. Okay, and you can see my cabinets come out really, really shiny. So let's go back into our material, and what I probably forgot to do is back in this wood material, I probably forgot to turn on this Fresnel reflection. So again, I always like to turn that on. Starts to give us maybe a little bit too strong reflections if we don't enable that. So with these Fresnel reflections, let's go ahead and re-render. There we are, much better. Now again, if we were to come in and get in just a little bit closer, you can definitely see where there is a lot of noise as far as the overall reflections are concerned, so we're really going to have to bring the glossy samples up for this. So back to our reflections, glossy samples. For this one, we'll probably have to get up pretty high, maybe something along the lines of 60 or maybe even higher, depending on just what we need. So re-render this real quick. There we go. Much, much better. So a little bit of noise maybe still in here. Now, before you start to go too crazy with the sampling settings and things like that, one thing that you may want to do is to come into your render settings and adjust your image precision or your anti-aliasing. This is something that actually has a really, really big impact on the overall quality of your image. And before you start to go, again, just too crazy with some of your sampling settings, some of these noise issues can sometimes be fixed up by just bumping up your aliasing settings. For my final output images, I usually use a high setting, so minimum of 1, max 16. So if I were to come in and try to re-render this with maybe these new settings, I'll just re-render just a piece of this for comparison. So move my region right in there, re-render this. Okay, and then once that's finished, again, if we were to get in here a little bit closer and take a look at that, compared to what I had before, this has actually helped out a little bit more. So you can definitely see a reduction in some of the noise in this area compared to some of these outer areas. Again, it takes a little bit of work, and it's a fairly subtle difference, but it is definitely there. So again, as I mentioned, that this material application process is probably going to be one of the more time-consuming areas of your entire scene setup. So really take your time, put a lot of love, a lot of effort into your materials, and really utilize the strategy of just rendering little bitty pieces of your scene at a time, just so you can check the current material that you're working on. And also, don't get too concerned with moving your camera in really, really tight and trying to render this from all different angles and making sure your material looks great from all different angles. Again, just stick with your camera view. If everything looks great from your camera and from this angle and from this resolution, then that's really all you need to worry about. Okay, so when we pick up in our next lesson, I'll go ahead and have the materials applied to all the rest of the objects in the scene, and we'll talk about some things to keep in mind for our final image output.